Tonight's presentation is entitled Owner in Command. It's sort of a quirky term that I came up with some years ago to try to convey an aircraft owner's responsibility for maintenance and airworthiness of the aircraft. And let me get into this subject by talking about a subject that almost all of us are intimately familiar with, and that's the concept of pilot in command. I assume most of us looked like there were almost 400 people in the room, and I assume that the majority of you are pilots. And as pilots, we had this whole concept of pilot in command beaten into our heads by our primary flight instructors. In my case, nearly 50 years ago. But the pilot in command concept is actually articulated in the regs in FAR 91.3. And what the FAA means by pilot in command is as follows. It says the pilot in command of an aircraft, this is right out of the FAR, is directly responsible for and the final authority as to the operation of that aircraft. So all of us, whether we're flying a cozy or a Dreamliner, we're pilot in command. We have this very, very heavy responsibility for the safety of the flight, and we also have enormous authority to carry out that responsibility. And in fact, our authority is so absolute when we're acting as pilot in command that FAR 91.3 says that in an emergency, we are authorized as PIC to deviate from any rule or regulation to the extent necessary to deal with that emergency. Probably the best known case of that is this. There's a Sully closing the door after he made sure that everybody got out. Actually, Jeff's role in this whole thing is a little bit underplayed, but this is one of my favorite pictures of the Miracle on the Hudson with Jeff helping out there. Here are a couple of other good PIC pictures, but to get serious about this, in my 45 years or so of flying, of being an aircraft owner and flying my airplane across the country, I've heard a lot of stuff on ATC frequencies, and heard a lot of pilots, and some of them encourage me, and some of them discourage me. And let me give you an example of an actual exchange that I heard some years back, probably quite a few years back, between a Cessna 182 pilot and air traffic control. This is just a small snippet of the conversation, but it'll give you the general idea. ATC says, Skyline 123, are you declaring an emergency? The pilot says, I guess so. ATC says, Skyline 123 say fuel and number of souls on board. Pilot says, Center, there are 3 on board. I think I have about 45 minutes worth of fuel. What should I do? ATC comes back and says, are you instrument rated? The pilot says negative. You can get the general flavor of what was going on. Now, the most discouraging thing for me when I listen to an exchange like this is that when the pilot said to the controller, what should I do? He was abdicating his responsibility as pilot in command. He was saying, you on the ground, you're flying the airplane now. I'm just taking orders. And that's not what we're supposed to be doing as pilot in command. You know, before the pilot did something like this, some of the things that really ought to be going through one's mind is the controller a pilot? Does he know anything about the capabilities of a Cessna 182? Does he know anything about the capabilities of this particular pilot? And most importantly, is the controller really qualified to be making life or death decisions about how to deal with the emergency? Should the responsibility for that be moved from the pilot's seat to the ground? I don't think so. This pilot just abdicated his pilot and command responsibility. And when I hear something like that, it doesn't set well with me. Here's another exchange that I heard some years ago when I was flying across the country, and it occurred in the general vicinity of Phoenix, Arizona. Pilot: Center, Merlin 456 is experiencing a pressurization problem. We need to descend immediately. ATC: Merlin 456, Albuquerque Center, maintain flight level 240, expect lower in 25 minutes. This controller obviously doesn't have a clue as to what pressurization problem actually means. Pilot: Center, Merlin 456 is declaring an emergency, vacating flight level 240 for 10,000. What heading would you like us to fly in our descent? This guy was pilot in command. He said, hey, I'm flying this airplane. I got a problem. I'm going to do what I need to do. You're there to help me. And that is exactly the attitude that pilot in command needs to have. Now, as pilots in our early training, we're taught about this whole PIC concept from our earliest days as student pilots, and hopefully, as we have matured as pilots, we have learned how to carry out that responsibility more and more effectively. But a similar concept applies to aircraft owners with respect to their responsibility and authority with respect to maintenance of their aircraft. And I call that concept owner in command. And in the same way that pilot in command is articulated in the FARs in FAR 91.3, owner in command is articulated in the FARs in 91.403, which is kind of a nice parallel. And what 91.403 says is that the owner of an aircraft is primarily responsible for maintaining that aircraft in an airworthy condition, including compliance with the airworthiness directives. And many owners, when they transition from being simply pilots to being aircraft owners, are really unaware of the heavy regulatory responsibilities that they bear with respect to airworthiness and maintenance. And the reason is primarily that to get a pilot's license, we have to go through a lot of studying and a lot of testing and instruction and a check ride and all sorts of stuff. So when we finally become pilots and get our pilot certificate, we're pretty up on this stuff. But when we transition from being a pilot to an aircraft owner, we don't have to go through any of that. There is no such thing as an aircraft owner certificate. The way we become aircraft owners is we write a check. No training, no testing, no studying, no check ride. We just write a check and suddenly we become an aircraft owner. And now 91.403 applies to us, but nobody's really taught us about that. So a lot of owners simply don't really understand what their responsibilities are, and even more importantly, what their authority is as aircraft owners. And most don't understand that the regulations give them a tremendous amount of authority, all the authority they need to carry out their responsibilities as being primarily responsible for airworthiness and maintenance. A lot of aircraft owners feel that mechanics get to call the shots when it comes to maintenance, and they're just bystanders who wait for the invoice and write the check. And that's not what the FAA intends. That's not what the regs say, and that's not the way things really ought to be. Owners are, of course, permitted by virtue of being aircraft owners to perform a wide range of preventive maintenance tasks on the aircraft, from oil changes to spark plug changes to tire changes, all sorts of things. There are a couple of dozen specific preventive maintenance tasks that the FARs allow an aircraft owner to do on a certificated aircraft that he owns without getting a mechanic involved. And some owners take advantage of that. Some owners prefer not to. When we get to more complicated maintenance, owners are required to hire an A&P or a repair station to do that, to either do it or at least supervise it, take responsibility for it, and sign it off. And then once a year, we're required to hire an A&P mechanic with inspection authorization or a repair station to perform annual inspections. Now, that's a quick summary of the rules for certificated aircraft. For EABs and LSAs, the rules are a little bit different as to who is allowed to do what. But regardless of who does the actual work on the aircraft, the owner is always responsible for the outcome in the eyes of the FAA. It is not mechanics that are responsible for maintaining the aircraft in airworthy condition. It is the owner who is responsible, and mechanics are simply people who the owner hires to help him carry out that responsibility. So a good way to think about it is that an owner of an aircraft is treated by the FAA as essentially the director of maintenance for a one airplane fleet, and the A&Ps and IAs that the owner hires are his hired help. He typically doesn't actually hire them as employees. He hires them as independent contractors, the way you would hire other skilled tradesmen. But basically, the aircraft owner is the person who's supposed to be calling the shots when it comes to maintenance, and the professionals that he hires are people that are supposed to help him carry out his responsibilities under the regs. A metaphor that I like to use to explain this is that basically the role of the aircraft owner, or what I call owner in command, is to act like a general contractor in charge of the maintenance of his aircraft, and that he hires people to help him do that, just like a general contractor would. An A&P mechanic is a licensed, skilled tradesman. Think about him as you would a plumber or a roofer or an electrician who has special training, special tools, and a piece of paper, or I guess plastic nowadays, from the government that says he's passed some tests and he's competent to do what he does. And he's hired by the aircraft owner, by the general contractor, to perform specific tasks, repairs, and alterations. And then the IA, who we need to hire once a year, is a licensed inspector, much like a building inspector, whose job it is to make a determination if the aircraft meets code. In this case, code is Part 43 of the FARs. So the situation is very similar to the situation that you'd have if you were, say, building a house, where you've got a general contractor who hires various skilled tradesmen to do various specific kinds of work on the house, and then brings in a building inspector to make sure the work has been done properly, and the building or the aircraft, whatever, is in compliance with the regulations. So, at any rate, the owner in command's job as general contractor of the maintenance of his aircraft is to select, hire, and manage these subcontractors, and if necessary, to fire them if they're not doing a good job. So it's very much a command kind of responsibility. A lot of owners don't treat it that way. A lot of owners don't understand that they're supposed to treat it that way. Many owners will put their airplanes in the shop, hand over the keys, and say, "Call me when you're done." That's not exactly the active management role that that an owner in command is supposed to take, and that the regulations contemplate. Some owners will give their mechanic carte blanche. They say stuff like, "Do whatever it takes to make the aircraft safe," and then they don't actually even know what work is done until they get the bill. Again, they're not managing the process. They're abdicating their responsibility when they do that. And many owners act as if it's the mechanic who is responsible for maintaining the aircraft in airworthy condition. But we know that 91403 says it is the owner who is primarily responsible for maintaining the aircraft in airworthy condition. And we're not supposed to be passing the buck like that. If we do that, isn't that a lot like the pilot, the Skylane pilot, who asked ATC, "What should I do?" Who's in command of this operation? Is it the owner or is it the mechanics? Well, the FAA says it's supposed to be the owner. And you can be sure that the owner will be held responsible for whatever the mechanics do, because he is at the end of the day responsible for the airworthiness of the aircraft. And in the same way that a pilot in command needs to remain in control when the airplane is in flight, the owner in command needs to remain in control when the aircraft is undergoing maintenance. He doesn't have to do the maintenance, but he has to be the decision maker. Now, I talk to a lot of aircraft owners who say, "Look, I don't know anything about maintenance. I don't even want to know anything about maintenance. Isn't that my mechanic's job?" And if you take that attitude, you're sort of missing the point. Going back to the building analogy, if you told your plumber or your electrician or your roofer or your auto mechanic, for that matter, just do whatever it takes and bill me when you're done, the chances are you're not going to be happy with the result. If you're building a house, you're going to tell the plumber what kind of toilets you want and where you want the shower, where you want the bathtub. You're going to tell the electrician where you want convenience outlets and whether you want the house plumbed for Ethernet and whatever. And you're going to tell the roofer what kind of roofing materials you want. Do you want a metal roof? Do you want a concrete tile roof, and so on? You're not just going to say, go do your thing and send me a bill. You're going to tell them what you want them to do. And you're probably going to ask them to give you an estimate for what you've asked them to do, and then you're going to make sure that you approve the estimate before you give them the go-ahead. Well, we need to take that same attitude when we're dealing with mechanics and when we're having maintenance done on an airplane. So how can an aircraft owner learn to take command of maintenance? Well, you don't have to learn to be a mechanic, but you do need to learn enough about your aircraft and about the maintenance of your aircraft so that you can make informed maintenance decisions and to evaluate the advice that you get from your mechanics. It would be similar to if you had to go in for cardiac surgery. I don't know about you, but I would certainly want to. I don't know anything about cardiac surgery, but I sure would want to bone up on it before I approved the surgery and selected the surgeon and all of that kind of stuff. I want to do my homework. Yeah, I know years ago when I was actually diagnosed with a rare form of leukemia, and you can't believe how much research I did on that and how carefully I picked my oncologist. And fortunately, we did everything right, and I'm, I guess, 15 years out from the leukemia, and I'm cancer free. But boy, I sure took that pretty seriously. I didn't just turn myself over and say, "Do me." And we need to take that sort of attitude when we're talking about our airplanes, because that's life and death stuff too. Now, like anything else in aviation, it takes some effort to master learning enough about maintenance to be able to make informed decisions and to be able to evaluate the advice that you receive from mechanics. But today, aircraft owners have unprecedented access to maintenance expertise. The advent of the internet and Google and laptops and smartphones have been just total game changers for aircraft owners, because we now can get really smart about stuff really quickly. One of the best places to get smart about maintenance on your aircraft are the type clubs, and there are a whole bunch of type clubs. I've been very involved with the Cessna Pilots Association over the years. Involved in with the Bonanza Society for a while. I'm still very active with the Cirrus Owners and Pilots Association. But there are all these type clubs that are sources of enormous expertise on various kinds of airplanes. They typically have online forums where you can go get questions answered with remarkable speed. Typically, if the type club doesn't know the answer to the question that you're asking, they know who knows, and they can give you a vector. So I'm a big fan of type clubs. It's just a tremendous resource for aircraft owners to be able to get smart about the various maintenance issues on their airplanes, and to be able to evaluate what sort of maintenance decisions they should be making. These EAA webinar series are another great resource. I just checked. I've done 36 of them now that are all online on the EA video server. I didn't have room to list them all. These are about half of them, I think, that I've done. But there's a tremendous amount of good maintenance information on the EAA webinars, not just the ones I've done, but a lot of other presenters have as well. One of the webinars that I did that is a really good starting place for aircraft owners is one called 5 Secrets of Cost-Effective Maintenance. I'll call them 5 Secrets for Owners in Command. And there's a whole webinar that goes through this stuff, but the 5 secrets were simply choosing your shop or mechanic very, very carefully, the way you would choose a surgeon, for example. Most owners are not very good at doing this. They typically will just use the mechanic on their home field without really evaluating whether that mechanic is competent to do the work that they need to do. When we manage the maintenance of aircraft for our clients, we will typically use different shops for different things, because some things require different skill sets, and we're very big believers in going to specialists. Again, it's very much like medicine in that regard. The second secret is don't approve any work until you receive a written estimate. This notion of giving shops a blank check is a very, very bad idea. We don't do that when we take our cars into the shop. Most states have a law that says that an automotive repair place isn't allowed to even work on your car until they've prepared a work order with a specific estimate, itemizing the work they're going to do, telling you what it's going to cost, and actually getting your signature on the work order before they're authorized to proceed. I think that varies a little bit from state to state, but I think the rules are pretty much the same in most states. And if it's good enough for your car, it ought to be good enough for the airplane. The third rule, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, or don't let them fix it. The lion's share of scheduled preventive maintenance that shops do because the manufacturers recommend them are just total waste of money at best, and at worst they actually make the airplane less safe than if they let them alone. I'm a very big believer in doing maintenance on condition rather than on a timetable, and only doing maintenance when it needs to be done. Best thing you can usually do for an airplane is to leave it alone unless there's some obvious reason that it needs to be maintained. Obviously, there's certain maintenance, particularly annual inspections and stuff, that we're required to do on a particular schedule. But to the extent that we're not required to do scheduled maintenance, and most of the time we're not, we shouldn't do it. We should do maintenance on condition. The fourth rule is don't let them fix it until you're absolutely sure what's wrong. Probably the biggest single waste of time and money and general frustration and anguish that I see in the maintenance business are mechanics that attack an airplane with tools rather than doing a thorough diagnosis. And it's really important that owners not let mechanic shotgun problems, just using guesswork, changing parts, hoping to get lucky. You need to get a good, solid diagnosis before you start taking an airplane apart. And if the mechanic runs out of ideas, that's when you want to go get a second opinion, or even maybe before the mechanic runs out of ideas. That's when you want to go to the type club. That's when you want to go to a subject matter expert, and make sure that the diagnosis is solid before you start taking things apart. And finally, as I said, don't approve maintenance unless you're convinced it's truly necessary. Probably half the maintenance that gets done on owner-flown airplanes is maintenance that didn't need to be done, probably shouldn't have been done, and so you want to be very selective about what you approve and what you decline, and remembering that it's always the owner that needs to be in control of these decisions. You don't have to do the work, but you have to make the decisions as to what to do and who to do and who to have do it. Above all, owners need to stay in control of the maintenance of their aircraft. Again, this is the owner in command concept, and you need to be the command authority. And owners need to act like owners in command. They are the managers of the maintenance, and so they should be active managers. Some owners don't want to get that hands-on. There are other options, in the same way that if you didn't want to fly your airplane, you could hire a pilot to fly you around. You can, if you want, hire somebody to act as your owner in command proxy, if you will, and manage the maintenance of your aircraft for you. That's pretty much what I do in my day job. But for most owners, the better part of valor is to learn enough about the maintenance of their aircraft that they can manage it themselves. So the bottom line is we want you to take your owner in command responsibilities seriously, and realize that not only does the FAA hold you responsible for the airworthiness of your aircraft, but also gives you all the authority in the world to carry that out. You are supposed to be the boss of this process, and I encourage aircraft owners to act like that. So Tim, that's all I have. We can open it up for questions. I'll leave my contact information on the screen while we do the Q&A. And shoot.
Fantastic. All right. Yeah, we have some questions that have come in, and I'm sure we'll get more as we work through them. First one is from Thomas, and he asked, should there be such a thing as an aircraft owner's certificate, and why not?
Oh, what a great question. Well, of course, you could tell probably that I strongly believe there should be. There actually is such a thing as an aircraft owner certificate in a way, if you, for example, decide you want to use your aircraft for hire, you probably will need to get a Part 135 certificate. That's the closest to an owner certificate that we have in the system. But if you're not carrying people for hire, then there is no owner certificate. Do I think there should be? Absolutely. Absolutely no doubt in my mind that when somebody transitions from being a pilot to an aircraft owner, he should go through training, he should go through a testing, and he should earn an aircraft owner certificate giving him the right to be an aircraft owner. And I say this as a political libertarian. I definitely am not in favor of government overreach, but I do think that being an aircraft owner is one of the hardest jobs in aviation, with the broadest responsibility. And almost everybody else in aviation is certificated, that whether you're a pilot or an air traffic controller or a mechanic or a parachute rigger, you have to get a certificate. But the hardest job in aviation, which is being an aircraft owner, is an uncertificated job, at least if it's for private use. And I think it would be a great idea if we had an aircraft owner certificate. I don't think that's going to happen, and at least in my lifetime. I don't see any evidence that anybody in the FAA is interested in doing that, but I think it would be a marvelous idea, actually.
Carly makes just a comment here that's kind of funny. She says, there is not training to be a parent or a certificate required either.
Oh, a parent?
Yeah.
I like that.
Yeah.
And I guess you could argue that maybe there ought to be for that as well.
So a little comment here also. Let's see here. Donald says, please explain that owner is not responsible for the work the mechanic does. Otherwise, you're going to scare away airplane buyers.
I don't understand the question, to be honest with you. I'm not sure what...
I think he's saying that the owner is not responsible for the work the mechanic does.
Well,
maybe you don't agree with that. The owner is responsible.
I don't agree with it. The owner
you don't agree, okay.
Well, the owner is responsible for the airworthiness of the airplane. It's actually interesting that more owners get FAA violations for flying unairworthy airplanes than mechanics do for allowing them to be unairworthy, because again, in the view of the FAA, the mechanic is hired help. Okay, he is responsible for the workmanship of the work he does, but he is not responsible for deciding what needs to be done and what doesn't. That's the aircraft owner's responsibility. And again, the analogy of, you know, the roofer or the plumber or the electrician, I think, is a good one. The homeowner or his general contractor is responsible for speccing out what work should be done and approving that work, and presumably approving the estimate for that work. It's the tradesman, the plumber, the roofer, the electrician, or the mechanic who's responsible for carrying out that work. And he has to carry it out in a competent fashion. But it's not his responsibility to decide what needs to be done and what doesn't.
Okay, question from Brian. He says, what kind of maintenance am I allowed to perform if I were to purchase a type certificated airplane?
Well, the answer to that, and I actually if you drop me an email, I think I can probably point you to an article. But the answer to that is to go look up Part 43, Appendix A, which actually has 3 parts to it, and Appendix A sub C is a list of exactly what tasks the FAA allows an aircraft owner to do on his own recognizance, if you will, without getting an A&P involved. And if you look at that list, there are about 3 dozen tasks on that list. And about 2 dozen of them apply to airplanes. The rest of them apply to things like balloons and stuff. But there are roughly 2 dozen specific tasks that are enumerated in the regs, Part 43, Appendix A sub C, that owners of aircraft are allowed to do themselves. Some of them are things that I wouldn't particularly recommend owners doing themselves unless they're pretty heavily in the maintenance. Most of them are ones that are really a good idea for owners to do themselves. I actually like very much to see aircraft owners who get hands-on with their airplanes and like do their own oil changes and stuff like that, because I think it's really, really helpful for owners to understand the equipment, and there's nothing that lets you understand the equipment better than working on it. And also, a lot of airplanes, a lot of certificated airplanes, I mean, there are a few exceptions like Bonanzas, but a lot of airplanes, you can't do a decent pre-flight. I mean, you know, you look at a Cessna 210 or something, and you can open a little bitty oil door and peer in and see that the oil cap's on, and you can access the dipstick, but that's pretty much it. You can't see anything in the engine compartment. So owners that do their own oil changes and you know, wind up pulling the top cowling and stuff, actually get to see stuff that really needs to be looked at on a regular basis. So to me, an owner-performed oil change is sort of like advanced pre-flight for a lot of these airplanes. Now, there's some airplanes like Bonanzas or my Cessna 310 that have big hinged doors on the side of the engine compartments where you can actually do a pretty decent pre-flight without taking too much apart. But most single-engine airplanes aren't like that. And so I am a big fan of owner-performed maintenance. I'm a big fan of owner-assisted annuals. I think every owner would be wise to do at least one owner-assisted annual on each airplane that he owns, because there is nothing in the world that will teach you more about how that airplane works and what condition it's in than doing an owner-assisted annual. So I'm a big fan of owner-performed maintenance. But again, getting back to the original question, the list of things you're allowed to do without a mechanic involved is in Part 43, Appendix A sub C, and there are about 2 dozen items on the list. You as an uncertificated person can actually do anything on your airplane if you can get an A&P to agree to supervise you and sign off your work. But the 2 dozen or so things that are in Part 43, Appendix A sub C are things you're allowed to do without getting a mechanic involved at all. And you make a logbook entry, you sign it off with your own signature and pilot certificate, and you're good to go. Well change is sort of a classic example. Well, and filtered stuff.
Cool. There's a follow-on to that from Ralph. He says, can I repack my wheel bearings and clean fuel screen on my Piper Dakota 236?
You can, yes. Both of those are things that are enumerated in the list.
Great. Okay. And Terry says, can I, as the aircraft owner, take out an attitude indicator from the panel, send it to an FAA repair station, and reinstall when it returns after being overhauled? Or do I need to take it to an avionics shop and have them remove and reinstall?
You actually are not allowed to remove an instrument as a non-A&P. You don't have to take it to an avionics shop. You can take it to any old mechanic if you want. But the regs are pretty specific about that. And by the way, some of the things in Part 43 Appendix C are a little bit weird. So don't shoot the messenger on these things. But you are specifically allowed to remove tray-mounted avionics that remove from the front, if you will, that slide out from the front. So you know, if you had a Garmin 530 and you wanted to remove it from the panel and take it over to the avionics shop for repair, you are allowed to do that. You're not allowed to remove anything that comes out from the back, if you will, like an attitude indicator. Why that is, I don't know. I didn't write the reg, but that's what it says.
Okay, and Doug, following on to that, which of the items in Part 43 in the preventive maintenance list do you not recommend an owner do, even though they're allowed?
Well, now you're asking me to do this from memory. I'll give you a couple of highlights. One of the things that Part 43 Appendix A sub C allows an owner to do is to replace side windows on an aircraft. You're not allowed to replace a windshield, but you are allowed to replace side windows. Now, maybe there are some airplanes where that would be a reasonable thing for an owner to do, but certainly for every airplane I've ever worked on, side windows are sealed with a two-part catalytic sealant called PRC or ProSeal. It has various names that requires small tactical nuclear weapons to remove. It is a horrible job. It is a job that professional A&Ps absolutely hate to do, and I would not wish it on my worst aircraft owner enemy. Another example is that if you have an airplane that has oleopneumatic struts, the Part 43 Appendix A sub C allows you to service those struts. But servicing those struts often involves pressurizing them with 200 or 300 psi nitrogen. If you don't know what you're doing, you can get very seriously hurt, or you could very seriously hurt the aircraft. So that's another example of something that's allowed that I would not particularly recommend doing. Most of the items in the list are quite reasonable for aircraft owners to do. Some of them require more equipment than the average aircraft owner has. For example, you're allowed to change your own tires, but you would need to have a jacks and a bead breaker and an air compressor and stuff. So, you know, most owners will take their airplane to a shop to get the tires changed, but you're allowed to do it yourself if you want to.
Okay, and Rick just has a question here. You may have said it, but if so, I missed it. Correct me if I'm wrong, but don't you have to be a licensed pilot to conduct owner maintenance? There are owners that are not pilots.
That is correct. What the reg does say, and I'm glad you mentioned that, is that you, for a normal certificated aircraft, you have to both own the aircraft and you have to have at least a private pilot certificate. I'm trying to remember. For light sport aircraft, there's a special rule where you don't have to have a private pilot certificate, and I'm not totally up on the regs for LSAs, but there is a special case for LSAs.
Yeah, the special case is that you got to hold a private pilot certificate at least to do type certificated aircraft preventive maintenance. If you held a sport pilot certificate
right.
and owned a Piper Cub, which is a type certificated aircraft, but it's a light sport aircraft, so it can be flown by a sport pilot, you aren't allowed to do that preventive maintenance on the Piper Cub because you only hold a sport pilot certificate. That's the
right.
goofy thing in the reg there, that EAA would sure like to see change. There's no reason why a sport pilot couldn't do that.
Well, okay. and that also brings up another pet peeve of mine. You know, there was the question about whether I would like to see an aircraft owner certificate, which I would, but I would also like to see, and I don't think it's ever going to happen, but I would like to see the FAA willing to grant essentially a repairman certificate to the owner of a certificated aircraft who only wants to work on his own aircraft and is willing to put in the study that would grant him essentially A&P privileges on his own aircraft in the same way that an EAB owner who meets the 51% rule can get a repairman certificate for his aircraft. I'd like to see that concept extended to certificated aircraft, where the owner is not hanging up a shingle and working on other people's aircraft, but only wants to work on his own. Canada has really cool. Canada has something that sort of approaches that, yeah. But I don't think that there's any traction for that at the FAA, at least at the moment.
A question here from James. He said, my son recently purchased a Cessna 172N and wanted to have wingtip strobe lights installed. The A&P we hired quoted us $1,700 to $2,000 to complete the work. But when the work was completed, he presented us a bill for $3,200. What should we have done to make certain the mechanic stayed within his quote?
Well, you should have paid what he estimated and not paid his invoice. Unless he had an awfully good reason for his invoice, being so much above what he quoted, you should have refused to pay the excess. Sometimes there are contingencies. I mean, again, let's go back to the automotive example. You take your car into the shop for some work. They write up a work order and they estimate that to adjust the valves on your Mercedes 300 SD is going to cost $560. Now, if they start adjusting the valves and something breaks, and it turns out that instead of being a 6-hour job, it turns out to be a 9-hour job because something really bad happened, then what they're supposed to do is stop, call you up, and say, we need you to approve an amended estimate because X, Y, and Z happened, and it's going to take us longer than we expected, and then you need to approve that. But if they just go ahead and do it and present you a bill that's 50% higher than what they estimated, you aren't required to pay it. And in most states, that's what the law says. Now, for aircraft, most states don't have any laws about this because aircraft owners are presumed to be sophisticated enough that they could fend for themselves. But in a situation like that, and we face this sort of thing all the time in our managed maintenance practice, where we'll get estimates and then we'll get an invoice that is significantly above the estimate, and we'll push back on the shop and say, hey, you estimated X, you didn't advise us that there was any reason that estimate was going to be exceeded significantly, and so we're going to hold you to the estimate. Now, we typically won't do that if they come in, say, within 10% of what they estimated, but if there's a huge discrepancy and they haven't sought approval to exceed their estimate, then we're not going to let the owner pay the invoice. We're going to fight with the shop over it.
Okay, Gary asks, what if the aircraft manufacturer recommends scheduled maintenance that involves replacing a particular part, but the owner of the airplane disagrees with the need to replace the part. Can the owner overrule the replacement as long as the replacement part is still in perfect working order and fully safe and still able to fly the plane as usual?
With very few exceptions, the answer is absolutely. And in fact, we say no to hundreds of those things every week in our managed maintenance practice because most of them are nonsense. Now, there are two exceptions. One is if the replacement interval or overhaul interval or whatever it is that we're talking about is an airworthiness limitation. If it's in an airworthiness limitation section of the maintenance manual or of instructions for continued airworthiness. Now, legacy aircraft, the majority of the GA fleet that was certificated under the old regulation CAR3 typically have no airworthiness limitations, and so the issue, it doesn't even come up. Some of the newer aircraft that were certificated under the new regs, Part 23, will have an airworthiness limitation section. But there's typically very, very few things that are airworthiness limitations. And if a replacement interval that the manufacturer calls for is not in an FAA-approved airworthiness limitation section, then it's a mere suggestion and you don't have to do it. The other exception to the rule, obviously, is that if there's an AD that compels you to do it, then you have to do it, because ADs are non-negotiable. But if the manufacturer calls for an inspection or replacement or overhaul interval, and it's not an airworthiness limitation and it isn't mandated by AD, then it's a mere suggestion. You don't need to do it. So, for example, we manage about 10% of the Cirruses in the country, and most of them have Hartzell propellers that have a TBO of either 6 years and 1,800 hours or 7 years and 2,000 hours. And we routinely advise our clients, if they are operating the aircraft regularly and if they are not based in a high corrosion risk area like South Florida, that they can go, double the TBO without any problem. Those TBOs are completely non-compulsory. On the other hand, there are a couple of airworthiness limitations for the Cirrus. For example, the CAPS parachute system has to be, the canopy has to be refit and the rocket has to be replaced every 10 years. And it's a very expensive thing. It's about $15,000. But it's an airworthiness limitation and it's not negotiable. It has to be done, or the airplane turns into a very expensive paperweight. There are only a handful of airworthiness limitations for the Cirrus. There are none for most legacy airplanes, like say the Cessna 310 that I fly, or a Bonanza or Cessna 182, airplanes that were certificated under the old regs before the whole concept of airworthiness limitations got invented. Typically in modern airplanes like the Cirrus, anything that involves pyrotechnics, like the parachute, like the inflatable airbag seat belts that a lot of those airplanes have, that actually have explosives in them, those typically have a replacement interval that is an airworthiness limitation, and so it has the force of law. But very few things are like that, and most of the time when a manufacturer specifies a maintenance interval, you can do it or not do it as you choose. Did I lose you, Tim?
Yeah,
nope.
Sean has a question here. Can you recommend a good text or publication to help a new owner learn these things?
There's not very much written on this other than in magazine articles and stuff. I'm actually working on developing a series of books that's going to be a 5-volume series, but it'll probably be a couple of years before it's ready. I'll be sort of introducing a volume at a time, but there's not very much out there. I have about 50 maintenance columns that I've written in Sport Aviation that are all available online. As I said, nearly 40 maintenance webinars on the EAA video server. I've got a lot of stuff that I wrote for AvWeb that is still online, probably 50 or 60 maintenance articles there. So there's a fair amount of reading material, but there isn't really anything in book form that's very good. I'm trying to work on that, but it's a slow process to do that. Finally hired an editor, and we're actually getting kind of serious about it. But I'm hoping the first volume may be ready in time for AirVenture this year, but it's going to be a while till all of that stuff rolls out.
That sounds exciting. I'm looking forward to seeing that. Hey, doesn't the FAA have a little, I don't know if it's an advisory circular or a little guide or pamphlet for airplane owners where they try and maybe give a little bit more explanation about the regulatory requirements in simple, plain language? Yeah,
there is an advisory circular, and I wish I had the number on the tip of my tongue, but you're right, there is one. And in fact, I'm going to be doing a webinar in July on the subject of maintenance regulations called Rules of the Maintenance Game. Okay. But yeah, you're right. There is an advisory circular that does talk about the maintenance regs kind of from the owner's perspective.
Yeah. Donald just chimed in and said it's Plain Sense is the title of it, and that rings a bell with me. So it's titled Plain Sense. So if you did FAA Advisory Circular Plain Sense Google search, I bet you'd be able to download it off the web.
Very good.
So Michael says, to extend your contractor analogy, it's not uncommon for contractors to hold owners hostage. What happens when an aircraft mechanic refuses to sign off an airplane as airworthy unless certain maintenance is done that the owner doesn't believe is necessary?
Well, we deal with that a fair amount in my in my company's managed maintenance practice as well. And again, it's a great question, and it's a perfect example of how the FAA has explicitly given owners authority to deal with stuff like that. And you know, we actually did a webinar about that. I forget, it was a month or two ago, Tim. You'll have to remind me when it was. It was called How to Flunk an Annual Inspection. You remember that one?
Yeah, sure. That was just a few months ago. Yeah. So that.
And there's a webinar. If you look at if you just Google the title, "How to Flunk an Annual Inspection," it'll take you right to that. But the quick version is that if your airplane is in the middle of an annual and you get wrapped around the axle with your IA, and he says, "I'm not going to sign off the annual until you do X," and you say, "I'm not going to do X, that's ridiculous," and you can't come to agreement, then there's an officially FAA approved method of firing that IA in the middle of an annual, and it's called directing him to sign off the annual with discrepancies. And obviously you only do that if you are unable to negotiate a resolution with him in a more amiable fashion. Obviously you try to do that first, but if you get to an impasse, the mechanic cannot hold your airplane hostage. Basically, you direct him to sign off the annual with discrepancies, and he then signs off the annual as unairworthy, and gives you a signed and dated list of the things that are basically in dispute that he feels needs to be done and you don't want to do. At that point, you pay his bill, you take your airplane out of there, and find somebody else who has his head screwed on correctly to clear those discrepancies. The somebody else does not need to be an IA. It can be any old mechanic. And if you can't find a mechanic locally who will clear the discrepancies for you, and you need to fly the airplane somewhere else, you just apply for a ferry permit with the FSDO, which is typically granted the same day, and you fly the airplane on a ferry permit to wherever it needs to go to have those discrepancies cleared. And we don't encounter that often. I would say, we manage about 500 annuals a year right now, and I would guess we only have to pull the trigger on this, maybe 2 or 3 times a year. So it's not real common. It's probably less than 1% of the time, because we are pretty good at negotiating with IAs. But once in a while, you just get to an impasse, and like I say, there's a nice FAA-approved way to fire an IA in the middle of an annual if you just can't come to resolution. And there's a whole webinar on that subject that we did a couple months ago. It's called How to Flunk an Annual Inspection.
Yep, very good. Bernard is following up from that. He says, how do you deal with an IA who will not sign off an annual as unairworthy? So I guess what if an IA doesn't want to say?
He can't do that.
Can't do it.
I mean, first of all, I've never heard of an IA refusing to do it, and the reason is really obvious. By the time you get to the point where you want to ask an IA, we want to fire an IA and ask him to sign off an annual of discrepancies, he is even more anxious to get rid of you than you are to get rid of him. I mean, until he does this, he's not going to get paid. So I've literally never heard of an IA hesitate for a moment when they're asked to sign off an annual of discrepancies. But if an IA ever did that, and I honestly can't visualize that ever happening, all you do is pick up the phone, call the FSDO, find out who his principal maintenance inspector is, and complain. And he would sign that thing off in a heartbeat because he doesn't want to tangle with his PMI. I mean, that is the way owners fire. That's the FAA-approved way for an owner to fire an IA in the middle of an annual.
Cool. Comment here from Edmund about another reference publication. He said, you might want to advise that AC 43-9C covers maintenance records, methods, and procedures. So that might be another good reference that people want to look up, is AC 43-9C.
Right, and maintenance records are interesting because they are actually a joint responsibility between the mechanics who are working on the airplane and the aircraft owner. And the regs are interesting, and they are a little non-intuitive, and they trap aircraft owners a lot because they're not well understood. But basically, the regs require that any person who performs maintenance must make maintenance records, and the two regs 43.9 and 43.11 explain exactly what is supposed to be in those maintenance records. But the regs don't include any timeliness requirement. So if a mechanic could work on your airplane, give it back to you and say, I haven't gotten the paperwork done. The airplane's good to go, but I'll get you a logbook entry middle of next week, which happens all the time. And the owner will then get in the airplane and go fly it because the mechanic said he's good to go, and the owner is immediately in violation because it's the owner's responsibility to verify that the maintenance record entry has been made, and the owner is explicitly prohibited from, or not just the owner, but any pilot is explicitly prohibited from flying an aircraft after maintenance until it has been approved for return to service by an authorized person. The approval for return to service is a logbook entry with a signature on it. And so if you ever take an IOU from a mechanic for a logbook entry, and you go fly the airplane before you got that logbook entry, you are in violation, and I have seen numerous cases where owners were violated for doing that. The mechanic violates no rule. If the mechanic doesn't get you the logbook entry for 6 months, he has not violated any regulation, because there's nothing in the regs that says how quickly he has to finish up the paperwork. But if you fly the airplane without that signed logbook entry, you're in violation, and the FAA that's one of their favorite ways of busting aircraft owners.
Joseph wonders, who would you recommend hold the aircraft logbooks, the maintenance shop or the
Absolutely
owner?
not. There are many reasons why you never ever want to allow the maintenance shop to hold your records. This is another mistake that owners make all the time. In fact, in our maintenance management practice, not only don't we let the shops hold the records, we don't even let them have the records. We provide them with electronic scanned copies of the records. We advise the owners to keep the originals locked up in a safe somewhere, preferably a fireproof safe. And we require the shops to make all maintenance record entries on self-adhesive stickers, and never to write in a logbook, because we don't even let them have the logbook. There are a whole bunch of reasons for that. First of all, it is very common for shops to issue bad maintenance record entries. And we frequently will send them back and say, that's no good, do it over again. And of course, if they write right in the logbook, you can't do that. If they do their things on self-adhesive stickers, you have a chance to review them before you paste them in the logbooks. And if you don't like what they wrote, you send it back to them and said that's unacceptable. Another big reason is, well, actually several other good reasons. One is that the aircraft will be tremendously devalued if the logbooks are lost. And it's really in the aircraft owner's best interest to keep those things locked up in a real safe place. If you leave them down at the shop, you just never know what's going to happen. We had one thing happen a couple of years ago where Corona Airport in Southern California, there was a problem with the dam, and the airport wound up being several feet underwater, and everybody who left their logbooks down at the shop lost them. And you can't get them back, and insurance won't cover that. It's just a really bad thing. The third reason is that it is not unheard of when an owner and a mechanic get into a dispute that the shop hold the logbooks hostage, and we don't ever want to see that. Well, if they can't have the logbooks, then they can't hold them hostage, and we just don't let them ever have the logbooks. And there's nothing in the FARs that say that the shop ever needs anything but a copy of the logbooks. They don't ever have to have the originals, and we don't let them have the originals.
Okay, let's see here. Robert's wondering if you got any advice or to help him try and find a good local maintenance facility near him.
Well, if he drops me an email, I would certainly be willing to try to help.
And Ted's wondering, what's the best way to make decisions on orphan certificated aircraft in the absence of a type club?
Well, I mean, obviously, I'm not sure exactly what kind of aircraft we're talking about here, but that that's always a difficult situation. By orphan, I assume that it's an airplane whose manufacturer's gone out of business and has a very small fleet size, so small that there hasn't been a type club developed, and those aircraft are difficult to own. and pretty much the best thing you can do is try to seek out other owners of those aircraft and seek out mechanics who have experience on those aircraft. And the good news is it's a lot easier to do that now in the internet age than it used to. It used to be near impossible. But there is no question that orphan aircraft are difficult because the support system is pretty weak.
Okay. Thomas wonders, any idea how many single-person owners in command there are as compared to joint, more than one owners in command?
You're
Probably
talking
no
about
clue, huh?
how many owners, how many aircraft are solely owned as opposed to owned in partnerships and stuff?
I assume that's what he's asking.
Yeah, I don't really know the answer to that. In our practice, I would guess half the aircraft are solely owned, and another half may have 2 or 3 owners. We explicitly don't get into flying clubs or flight schools and stuff like that. So we're dealing strictly with owner-flown airplanes, and I would guess it maybe 50-50 in our practice, but that's obviously not representative of the entire GA fleet. I honestly don't know the answer to that, and I'm not even sure whether somebody like AOPA would know the answer to that. I just don't know.
Robert's wondering if you could give some examples of replacement parts that you routinely say no to replacement.
Sure. I'll give you some ideas just on Cirruses, just because we do so many of them, and they're right at right off the top of my head, but you'll get the idea. Cirrus calls for replacing. It's got a dual electrical system with 2 batteries and 2 alternators because it's an all-electric airplane, and they call for replacing the number 2 batteries every 2 years. We always say no to that. It doesn't make sense to replace batteries on a timetable. What makes sense is to do a capacity check on the batteries every year, and if their capacity has diminished, in fact, it's interesting. The battery manufacturers, both Teledyne Gill and Concorde, which are the 2 main aircraft battery manufacturers, both specify that their batteries should be replaced on condition with a capacity check rather than any fixed timetable. And they basically give instructions for doing a capacity check, and if the battery capacity has dropped to below either 80% or 85%, depending on which manufacturer it is, then you're supposed to take the battery out of service. So the battery manufacturers themselves don't recommend replacing batteries on a fixed timetable, but the aircraft manufacturers do. And the aircraft manufacturers' instructions typically are supposed to take precedence over the instructions of the component manufacturers. But as I said, the aircraft manufacturers' instructions are almost always optional. Unless it's an airworthiness limitation, so we say no to that. Another thing, Cirrus calls for replacing the filter in their TKS anti-icing system every 2 years. It's an expensive filter, and it takes a lot of work to replace. And we have never ever seen a TKS filter come out of an airplane that wasn't spotlessly clean, because all that ever goes through it is pure TKS fluid. So what we tell our Cirrus owners is, unless you have some good reason to believe that somebody poured a Diet Coke into your TKS tank, leave the darn filter alone unless you're having problems with your TKS system. And these things go on and on. The Continental recommends cleaning fuel injectors prophylactically every a few hundred hours. but that's a vestige from back in the days when people didn't have engine monitors. With an engine monitor, I mean, you can look at the data and know whether you've got a clogged injector or not. So it's crazy to be removing them and cleaning them prophylactically and putting them back in when you can just check the engine monitor data and know when you've got a dirty injector, and if you do, know which one it is, so that you only have to mess with the one that's dirty, not with all of them. Prophylactically cleaning injectors is something that has been shown over the years to do much more harm than good. And the injectors typically stay very clean because they've got a very good solvent running through them all the time. It's called 100 low lead. So the only time that injectors need cleaning is when foreign material gets into the fuel system and lodges in an injector. And the most likely time for that to happen is when a mechanic has opened up the fuel system. So we try to prevent mechanics from opening up the fuel system unless there's a really, really good reason. And I mean, I could go on and on, but there's a zillion things. In fact, I think one of the webinars that I did actually went through a Cirrus annual and actually went through every item that the shop recommended and each item that we either approved or declined, and we declined at least half of the items that the shop recommended. And that's routinely what we do, because most of them are either unnecessary at best or actually harmful at worst, like the injector cleaning.
Got you. Jerry's wondering if you could explain what a mechanic's lien is and what rights you may have to remove your aircraft after you have disputed unprecedented cost beyond the initial estimate.
Mechanic's lien, I'm not a lawyer, so I probably shouldn't say too much about it, but in most states, mechanics, whether they're aircraft mechanics or car mechanics, have the right to place a lien on a vehicle if they have been authorized to work on the vehicle and then don't get paid for their work. Mechanic's lien is hard to get. It typically requires months from the time the mechanic files the paperwork to the time the lien is perfected and there's a court order allowing the mechanic basically to sell the airplane in order to pay for what he's owed. So it typically doesn't happen unless there's a real battle between the mechanic and the owner. And if things ever get that far, then somebody hasn't been watching very closely. If a mechanic provided a written estimate for work and then grossly exceeded the estimate, the owner who has the written estimate has a very, very strong case against the mechanic. On the other hand, if the owner doesn't get a written estimate, and that happens an awful lot, then the mechanic can invoice the guy for anything he wants, and the owner doesn't have a leg to stand on. Basically, you either have a specific contract with the shop to do certain work for a certain price, which is really what the written estimate is all about, or you don't have a contract. You've given them a blank check. You said, "Here's my credit card, do me." And owners should never do that, because then they're in a very bad position. The mechanic can hold the airplane and until the owner pays the bill or files a lawsuit or something. It's almost never a good idea to file a lawsuit over stuff like this, because the cost of litigation is so high that if the damages aren't many tens of thousands of dollars, it's just a lose-lose situation. You do not want to be resolving these things in court. But
Okay.
we in our managed maintenance practice, we're sort of thrust into the role of sort of being a mediator between owners and mechanics all the time, and that can sometimes be helpful because the mechanic may be mad at the owner and the owner may be mad at the mechanic, but if you can get somebody in the middle who isn't mad at anybody, sometimes you can craft a reasonable compromise. Emotion is really the villain here, where owners will sort of shoot themselves in the foot by standing on principle and then winding up having the airplane imprisoned, and we don't like to see that happen.
Michelle's wondering, what are the responsibilities for operators who rent aircraft versus operators who own aircraft?
Operators who rent aircraft. I don't really understand.
Pilots
Yeah.
flying a rented aircraft versus a pilot owning an aircraft that they own. What's the difference?
A pilot who is not the owner of the aircraft basically has no responsibility for maintenance. What he does have a responsibility for, what every pilot has a responsibility for, is to make an airworthiness determination of the aircraft before he flies it, and that's FAR 91.7. That places the burden on the pilot in command to make a determination that the aircraft is airworthy before he's allowed to fly it. Now, the regs are very unclear about what that means. Clearly, clearly a pilot who is not a mechanic, it cannot reasonably be expected to make a very sophisticated airworthiness determination. If a pilot flew a rental airplane and it got ramp checked and it discovered that it had an unauthorized propeller on it, I can't imagine that the renter pilot would be busted for that, because a renter pilot doesn't have the training or knowledge to verify that whether the propeller on that airplane is the one that's supposed to be there. That's why they pay IAs the big bucks, because they're supposed to know how to do that once a year. On the other hand, if you went and rented a 172 and the doors were off of it, I think you would probably, as a pilot, be expected to verify that that airplane is allowed to fly with the doors off of it. Or if there was some obvious damage to the airplane, big dent in the leading edge of the wing, I think that the FAA would hold the pilot responsible for making a determination that that airplane didn't look like it was safe to fly, and so if he went ahead and flew it, that he would be in violation of 91.7. But I do also think that renter pilots would probably be held responsible for verifying that the aircraft is inannual, for example. But I think that's about the limitation. It's the owner, not the pilot, who is responsible for maintenance. And the pilot does have some airworthiness determination responsibility under 91.7, but it's unusual for the FAA to violate a renter pilot for an airworthiness issue unless it's such an obvious airworthiness issue that a pilot who is not a mechanic could reasonably be expected to know that the airplane's unairworthy.
Okay, getting to the end here. Let's do another one here from Tim. What should I carry in the plane for emergency maintenance? He's got a PA 32-300.
Great question. I wrote an article about that years ago. I think it's still available online on AvWeb, and the title of it is The Traveling Toolkit. If you Google Traveling Toolkit Mike Bush, I'm sure you'll go right to it. And it's a whole article on the subject of what kinds of tools and spares you might want to be carrying in an airplane to deal with contingencies.
Excellent. Last question here. So comment about liability concerns. What sort of liability concerns should a pilot or owner in command have after they sell their aircraft?
None. When you sell an airplane, you enter into a purchase sale agreement with the buyer, and that purchase sale agreement almost always is very clear that the buyer is buying the aircraft as is, and that the seller is not providing any sort of warranty on the aircraft other than a few enumerated items. And again, we have a big pre-buy program, and I'm sort of the guy in our company who reviews all the purchase sale agreements, so I know all about these agreements. But typically, the only thing the seller warrants in a purchase sale agreement is he warrants that he's selling the airplane with clear title. That is, there aren't any liens against the airplane. That he is selling the airplane with complete logbooks, assuming that he has complete logbooks. Let me think for a second. And typically he's selling the airplane with a current annual inspection. And normally that's it. And the rest of it is the buyer's responsibility to make sure that the airplane is what the buyer expects. But normally after title transfers, unless there was some really demonstrable fraud involved, the seller has no continuing liability. But the purchase sale agreement is the thing that controls what the seller is representing to the buyer in the transaction. So it has to be worded fairly carefully to make sure you're protected.
Okay, fantastic. Well, Mike, thank you so much. That was a great question and answer session tonight. And I just want to make a comment to everyone still tuned in that just to remind everybody that Mike is a volunteer, and he volunteers to do this for EAA and to provide you this information. So I sure do thank you, Mike, for that.
Gosh,
volunteer effort.
I'm not getting paid, huh?
Well, how about we give you a nice cup of coffee and a warm donut at Oshkosh? Let's get together and do that. How about
there
that?
You go.
Hey, any last comments you want to make
Okay.
to those still tuned in?
Yeah, I just wanted to put up the next few webinars. The June one. Hopefully, if this title doesn't get a good turnout, I don't know what will. How to destroy your engine in 1 minute. It's going to be all about detonation, pre-ignition, bad things that happen in engines, and how pilots can detect and react to them to prevent the engine from being destroyed. In July, as I mentioned, we'll do a webinar on maintenance regulations and kind of walk through the key maintenance regulations called Rules of the Maintenance Game. And finally, August, we're going to be doing it the second Wednesday in August instead of the first because of AirVenture. And it will be another subject that came up tonight in the discussion is resolving owner-mechanic disputes. So those are the next three, and finally, when Tim pushes the button to end the webinar, you guys are going to be taken to a survey. If you would like to sign up for my monthly newsletter, which is all about maintenance stuff, just check the appropriate checkbox on the survey. Or if you don't take the survey, you can also sign up for the newsletter just by going to savvyaviator.com, and there's a box on the website there to sign up for the newsletter. The newsletter comes with an unsubscribe link, so if you don't like it after getting a couple issues, you can click on the unsubscribe list and take yourself back off. That's all I have.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Mike. Great job. A lot of comments coming in reiterating great job, and thank you very much for the presentation tonight.
Okay. Well, thank you, everybody. And we'll see you next month.